The knock that changed everything did not sound urgent, but it carried a weight that settled in my stomach before I even opened the door. I remember staring at the peephole and seeing nothing but the vague blur of shapes, thinking it was a delivery. I had no way of knowing that my entire life was about to be handed to me without my permission. When I finally turned the handle and pulled the door open, my sister stood there smiling too brightly, and her 3 children huddled behind her with suitcases lined neatly like she was checking them into a hotel. That was the moment the hook tightened around my quiet, carefully managed life. My name is Alara, and I should have closed the door right then. Instead, I froze. My sister, whose confidence always seemed to spill into entitlement, pushed the largest suitcase forward with her foot. She said our mother had decided I would watch the kids until she and her husband got back on their feet. Her tone suggested the decision had been made unanimously by a committee I had never been invited to join. Before I could react, before I could even swallow, she ushered the children inside, like my apartment was a temporary shelter she had reserved months in advance. I worked full-time. I lived alone. I liked living alone. And nothing in the universe had prepared me for 3 children under 10 running through my space, as if they were claiming territory. I kept waiting for the punchline, for my sister to laugh and say it was temporary, maybe an hour or 2, but the way she settled onto my couch told me she had no intention of leaving without unburdening herself. I asked her where she was going. She said Aunt Mara had offered her a job out of town and she needed to move quickly. I asked why I had not been consulted. She shrugged and said family duty. That phrase hit harder than anything else because it was our mother's favorite shield, the one she used whenever she needed me to do something she never expected of anyone else. My sister had learned to wield it just as effortlessly. I called our mother, hoping there had been a misunderstanding. She answered cheerfully and said she was proud of me for stepping up. Proud of me, as if I had volunteered. She talked about how the children needed stability and how I was the responsible one. Every sentence placed another stone on my chest. I tried to push back, tried to explain that I had a demanding job and no experience raising kids. But she dismissed my protest with a soft laugh and a reminder that this was what family was for. By the time I hung up, the children had unpacked. Their clothes were scattered across my living room floor, toys rolling under furniture, shoes tossed onto my coffee table. The youngest had already spilled juice on the rug. It felt like my home was dissolving molecule by molecule. My sister hugged me briefly, whispered thank you, and left before I could find the words to stop her. The first hour felt surreal. The first day felt suffocating. The first week felt like my identity was being peeled away in long, invisible strips. Every time I tried to set boundaries, someone in my family reminded me of their version of responsibility, which always meant I sacrificed, and they applauded themselves for suggesting it. The moment everything shifted was quiet, almost unremarkable. I was standing in the kitchen one evening, washing dishes, while the children argued loudly in the hallway. My phone buzzed with a message from my sister saying she might need a few more months than she planned. Not an apology, not a discussion, just another decision she assumed I would accept. I stared at the screen and felt something settle inside me, not anger, not fear, something colder and clearer. I typed back, if you insist. She read it as compliance, but it was a promise. That night, after the children were asleep, I sat on the edge of my bed and began planning the escape I would not tell anyone about. I kept my voice steady at every family call. I smiled when I had to. I did the work, I played the role, all while building a quiet, invisible path out of the life they had written for me. They thought they had trapped me. They had no idea I was already walking away. The second month was when I stopped pretending any of this would balance itself out. At first, I kept waiting for a moment of relief, for my sister to announce she had found stable work or a real apartment, or at least to admit she had dropped her responsibilities onto me without warning. Instead, every day unfolded exactly like the one before it. A looping reel of chaos I could never pause. I woke before sunrise to pack lunches, woke the children who refused to wake, ushered them into clean clothes, and drove them across town before driving myself to work. I tried to maintain the quiet professionalism I had built over years, but meetings blurred with background noise, and every interruption felt like another piece of me cracking away. When my manager called me into her office one afternoon to ask if everything was all right at home, I smiled too tightly and lied. I said I was just adjusting to having family around. She nodded kindly, but I saw the concern in her eyes. I had been the one they could rely on, the one who stayed late and took on extra projects. Now I rushed home every evening, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. The children waited at the school pickup area, and the staff there had already begun giving me looks that implied judgment. I carried the expectation of perfection, like a weighted vest that grew heavier with each request. My apartment had stopped feeling like a sanctuary. Toys covered every surface, laundry sprouted from corners, and the noise never settled. Even at night, when the children were finally sleeping, I stayed awake trying to regain some semblance of order, folding clothes, washing dishes, answering emails I had ignored earlier, and wondering when my sister planned to take any responsibility for the lives she had brought into the world. Every time I tried to talk to her, she insisted she was doing her best. She said I had always been good with structure, so I handled routine better than she could. It was her way of praising me while turning me into a convenient solution. My mother was no better. When I admitted I was overwhelmed, she said I should be grateful for the opportunity to step up and prove myself, as if caretaking without consent was some kind of honor bestowed only upon daughters like me, the ones who never pushed back hard enough to break the family rhythm. I tried explaining that I could not keep doing this alone, that it was affecting my work and my mental stability, but she dismissed it with soft disappointment, the kind that suggested I had failed a test I never agreed to take. She said real family supports each other without complaint. It was astonishing how quickly guilt became their currency. If I hesitated at a request, my sister launched into a spiral about how hard her life had been, how she was trying, how she needed just a little more time. A little more time meant another week, then another month, until time itself lost shape. The resentment did not arrive all at once. It built slowly in thin sediment layers that eventually hardened into something sharp and unyielding. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day, I sat in my car outside my building and let the silence sit heavy on my chest. It was the only silence I had left. I realized I had not made a single decision about my own life in months. Every hour was dictated by someone else's needs. It struck me then that I had been erased, not loudly, not violently, but gradually erased by expectations I never consented to bear. That was the moment I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I stopped looking for fairness from people who benefited from my obedience. I smiled when necessary, nodded when expected, and gave them nothing more than the version of me they wanted to see. Behind that mask, I began shaping something they could not imagine. My plan did not require confrontation or drama. It needed only patience, precision, and the quiet endurance I had perfected over years of being the reliable one. The birth of my silence was not surrender. It was the first step toward freedom they would never see coming. The morning I left did not feel like an ending. It felt like an exhale I had been holding for far too long. The children were at school, their backpacks left in the hallway where they had dropped them the night before. My sister had promised she would pick them up that afternoon, but her promises had become little more than background noise by then. I stood in the center of my living room, or what used to be my living room, and looked at the remnants of a life that no longer felt like mine. Toys, forgotten shoes, art projects taped crookedly to the walls, all the things that had slowly taken up space until I had none left. I did not feel guilt. I expected to, but what I felt instead was a calmness that surprised me, a clarity. I knew that if I stayed even one more day, I would lose pieces of myself I might never recover. I took the 2 bags I had prepared over the previous week and placed them by the door. Every item inside had been chosen carefully. A few clothes, my passport, my laptop. Nothing sentimental. Sentiment had been a luxury I could no longer afford. I went through each room one last time to make sure I had taken only what belonged to me. Then I paused in the doorway and took in the space that had once been my refuge. It felt like a stranger's home now. When I locked the door behind me, the click felt like a seal, a quiet confirmation that I was not coming back. I walked down the stairs without hurrying, without looking over my shoulder, without letting myself think too hard about anything. At my car, I turned off my phone and placed it in the glove compartment. It was symbolic at first, a small gesture. Then it became a boundary, Then it became freedom. By the time I reached the highway, I had already decided not to turn it back on. I crossed state lines by evening, though the miles blurred together. I stayed one night in a small motel with peeling paint and an old television that barely worked. It did not matter. I slept harder than I had in months. The next morning, I left my car in long-term parking at an airport I had never been to before. I bought a ticket to the first international destination with an open seat. It was not glamorous. It was not dramatic. It was simply available. That was enough. The moment the plane lifted from the runway, a weight lifted from my chest. I watched my city shrink beneath the clouds and felt nothing but relief, no sorrow, no longing, no second thoughts. I had lived my entire adulthood in service to expectations I never agreed to carry. Now I had slipped out of them like an old coat that no longer fit. The first place I landed was noisy and bright, a city where no one cared who I was or where I had come from. I rented a small room with a narrow bed and a window that rattled whenever buses passed. It felt perfect. I enrolled in short classes, things that interested me, things I had never let myself explore. Languages, creative work, business courses. I took online jobs that allowed me to work on my own schedule. I learned how to live quietly, without apology, without debt to anyone else. Meanwhile, I imagined the panic building back home. My mother leaving frantic voicemails. My sister scrambling to explain why she had assumed I would always pick up the pieces. They would frame my disappearance as selfishness. They would turn me into the villain. It did not matter. They could only call me selfish because they had forgotten I existed outside their needs. With every week that passed, I shed another layer of the person they believed me to be. I learned to navigate unfamiliar streets. I learned to trust my own decisions. I learned that silence can be a form of power when it is chosen and not imposed. I traveled to places that made me feel small in the best way, places where I could start over without anyone watching. Somewhere between one country and the next, I became someone new, someone unburdened, someone defined not by obligation but by intention, someone my family had never imagined because they had never taken the time to look. And I knew even then that when I eventually returned, I would not be returning to them. I would be returning as myself. When I stepped off the plane back into my home state, the air felt thinner, as if the place itself remembered the version of me that had left and could not quite reconcile who I had become. A full year had passed. I arrived with a new career built entirely from skills I had earned quietly, traveling and studying and working without a single safety net. I had savings that were mine alone, credentials no one could claim influence over, and a confidence that did not feel borrowed or fragile. I was not returning to slip back into old patterns. I was returning to end them. I waited 3 days before contacting my family. 3 days to adjust, to sleep, to gather my mind and choose my words with intention. I knew they had been desperate for answers. Their messages had piled up over the past months, whenever I allowed my phone to briefly connect. The tone of their concern had shifted over time from righteous anger to anxiety to something closer to fear. When I finally sent a simple message saying I was back in town and willing to meet, my sister responded within moments, as if she had been watching her phone with the screen on. She chose our mother's house as the meeting place. I arrived on time, not early, not late. When I walked in, their faces carried a mix of relief and confusion, like they recognized me but could not place where they had seen me before. My sister stood in the living room with a carefully constructed expression, the kind she used when she wanted to appear composed and self-aware. She opened her arms as if expecting an embrace, but I stayed where I was and offered a small nod instead. It was enough to make her arms slowly lower to her sides. She started talking immediately, her voice soft and trembling in strategic places. She said she had done her best. She said the children had missed me. She said she had never wanted to burden me, but everything had been so overwhelming, and she thought I understood. She spoke as if she were the one who had been abandoned, as if she were the one seeking forgiveness. I let her speak without interrupting, without reacting, without offering any verbal lifeline. The more she talked, the less convinced she sounded. My mother stepped in next. She said my disappearance had been cruel. She said she had spent nights awake, worried sick, imagining the worst. She said no matter how stressed I had been, there were better ways to handle things. She said adults did not simply walk away. She said a lot of things that skirted the edges of responsibility but never crossed into acknowledgement. I listened to her the same way I had listened to my sister, letting her fill the room with excuses that grew thinner with every sentence. When they finally fell silent, I took a breath. It felt like the first deep breath I had taken in that house in years. I spoke calmly, not raising my voice, not matching their emotional tones. I told them exactly what had happened. I described the months of unpaid labor, the constant expectations, the refusal to acknowledge my exhaustion, and the way every boundary I tried to set had been treated like an inconvenience. I told my sister her children had never been my responsibility. I told my mother her guilt only appeared when my absence forced her to confront her own choices. I told them both I had spent my entire adulthood being the reliable one, because they had grown accustomed to using me as a solution to their own failures. I watched the realization settle in, slow and heavy. My sister's eyes filled with tears, but she did not reach for me. My mother pressed her lips together, as if trying to hold in a rebuttal she could not logically justify. Their excuses crumbled under the weight of my clarity. There was nothing to argue with. Every sentence I spoke was a truth they had always known but never wanted acknowledged. For the first time in my life, they saw me not as the dependable daughter or the backup caretaker or the girl who never complained. They saw the woman who had built an entire life away from them. A woman they had pushed to the edge without noticing. A woman who had returned only because she chose to, not because she needed them. Recognition flickered in their eyes. And then something else. Understanding. My sister believed that a single conversation would rewind the entire year, as if the moment I stepped back into her orbit, the old dynamics would fall neatly into place. She assumed regret had softened me. She assumed time had humbled me. She assumed my return meant reconciliation was inevitable. I saw the expectation in her posture, in the way she spoke carefully and waited for me to fill the silence. She kept offering explanations disguised as apologies, and each one revealed how little she understood. She did not want accountability. She wanted reset. She was not going to get one. For weeks after that first meeting, she contacted me constantly, sending long messages about how families should work together and how she wished things had gone differently. She tried to paint herself as overwhelmed rather than irresponsible. She said the children were asking about me, though I wondered if that was another attempt to tug on the part of me she had relied on for years. I could feel her trying to guide me back into the role of caretaker, mediator, fixer. The role she believed was still waiting with my name etched into it. She had no idea how thoroughly I had erased that version of myself. I documented everything, every message that shifted blame, every request masked as necessity, every attempt to rewrite events. I saved the texts where she insisted I had volunteered, the ones where she said she was doing me a favor by showing me what real responsibility looked like. I saved the ones where she tried to frame my disappearance as evidence of emotional instability, rather than an act of survival. I saved the ones where she tried to guilt me for rebuilding my life, instead of waiting for her to reclaim the children she had abandoned. I kept it all. Then I began sharing it. Not out of vengeance, though many assumed that was my goal. I shared it because truth deserves witnesses. I reached out to every authority she had lied to when she insisted I had agreed to be temporary guardian. I clarified every detail. I contacted the school that believed I was the primary parent for an entire year. I contacted the agencies she had attempted to use to secure housing by claiming I had promised financial support. I contacted the mutual friends she had vented to, the ones who had quietly judged me. I gave them facts instead of interpretations. Her well-crafted narrative unraveled quickly. It turned out reputations built on convenience collapse the moment reality presses against them. My mother tried to intervene. She said I was being harsh. She said families should handle matters privately. She said my sister was having a difficult time and needed compassion. I told her compassion had been the very thing she mistook for compliance. I told her silence had been the language she trained me to use and the weapon she expected me never to wield. I told her I had nothing left to offer the version of them who only listened when consequences appeared. In the end, I did not need to shout. The truth was loud enough. My sister tried to fix her image, but cracks appeared every time someone compared her version of events to the documentation I had provided. She tried to appeal to sentiment, but sentiment holds no power once respect has evaporated. She tried to reach me again, sending messages that grew shorter and more panicked. I read them without replying. Every attempt she made to pull me back into her gravity only confirmed why I had left in the first place. I walked away entirely, not in anger, not in triumph, in certainty. Certainty is a quiet thing. It does not flare or demand attention. It settles into your bones and steadies your breath. It shapes your choices without requiring permission. When I stepped out of their lives for the second time, it was clean, absolute, and final. There was nothing left between us that needed repair. In the stillness that followed, I found something I had not expected, a kind of afterglow, warm and reflective, born from understanding rather than bitterness. Betrayal is not rare. It moves through families, friendships, and relationships like an old river carving new paths through familiar landscapes. The pattern repeats across time and place. People forget the weight of the roles they assign to others, and those others learn to carry the cost in silence until the silence becomes its own kind of revolution. Survival is not loud. It is steady. It reshapes you quietly. And long after the story ends, the legacy of choosing yourself continues to grow. Like a slowly expanding horizon no one else can take credit for,